The Galactic Council had existed for over 20,000 years. It was powerful, respected, and feared. Hundreds of alien species had joined it over the centuries. Some joined willingly, hoping for peace. Others were forced to join after wars. The Council made the laws, the Council kept order, and for a long time no one questioned it. Then the humans arrived. Humanity had always been different. They came from a small blue planet called Earth, far from the center of the galaxy. When they discovered faster-than-light travel, they didn't ask for help. They built their own ships, explored space on their own, and learned quickly. The Council watched with interest then concern. The Council sent a welcome message. "Join us," they said. "Be part of the galactic community. We can teach you. We can guide you." The humans responded politely but carefully. They didn't rush into any agreements. They asked questions, many questions. They studied the Council's history. They read the fine print. They noticed how many species had lost their freedom after joining. Years passed. The humans built trade routes, made friends with smaller species, and even helped settle disputes peacefully. Still, they did not join the Council. Some Council members grew impatient. One member, named Makar, said, "They're too proud. They think they don't need us." Others said, "They will come around. They're just slow to trust." Finally, the day came when Earth's representatives stood before the Council. The chamber was large and filled with leaders from over 500 species. The humans walked in calmly. Their main speaker, a middle-aged woman named Lynn, stood tall and spoke with a clear voice. "We thank the Galactic Council for your offer," Lynn said, "but after long discussion, we have chosen not to join." The chamber fell silent. "We respect your achievements," she continued, "but we believe in walking our own path. We do not wish to be ruled. We wish to be partners, not followers." Some council members laughed, others looked angry. One shouted, "You insult us," but Lynn did not react. She simply said, "We walk away in peace. Do not follow us." Then the humans left. That day, something changed. The council tried to hide it, but many felt uneasy. Humans had just done something no species had dared before. They had refused the council, not with war, not with anger, but with calm and clear words. Makar, a high-ranking council member, could not sleep that night. She sat in her dark office thinking. "They should be afraid," she whispered. "But they're not." "Why?" She ordered reports from council spies. What she found surprised her. In just 20 years, humans had created deep friendships with many independent species. They had shared food, medicine, even defense systems. They were not trying to take over, but they were spreading their values: freedom, choice, respect. Makar did not like it. "They're growing without us," she said, "and we can't control them." Some council leaders wanted to punish humanity. "We should block their trade, ban their ships, show them who rules the stars." But others were afraid. "They're not like others. They adapt too fast. If we push them, they might push back harder." Still, the council voted. Sanctions were placed on human trade. Their ships were stopped. Their stations were harassed. The message was clear: come back or suffer. But the humans didn't come back. Instead, they quietly moved their trade routes. They built faster ships. They improved their technology. And they shared it with others. Small planets that had once felt ignored by the council now looked to Earth for support. And Earth helped, not with force, but with kindness and cooperation. A year later, a quiet voice began to whisper across the stars. "The humans are building something new. Not an empire. Something else." In a hidden meeting on a cold planet, a small species called the Terrene asked to speak with a human captain. The captain came alone. The Terrene leader said, "The council taxes us. They do not protect us. But you helped us when our son grew unstable. You didn't ask for anything. Why?" The captain smiled. "Because it was the right thing to do." The Terrene joined the humans, then the Veyari, then the Drex. One by one, small free peoples began working with Earth. Not as soldiers, not as servants, but as equals. Back at the council, Makar read the reports in silence. Her claws tapped the table slowly. They didn't just walk away, she whispered. They started something dangerous. Her aide looked confused. But they haven't fired a shot. Makar shook her head. They don't need to. They are changing the rules, and if we don't stop them soon, it will be too late. Outside the council's great city, a human freighter landed at a neutral station. A message played across the galaxy. We do not seek war. We do not seek control. But we will never kneel. To those who wish for freedom, walk with us. To those who threaten it, know this: humanity stands ready. The galaxy listened. Some laughed, some grew quiet, and deep inside the council, many finally understood what had happened that day. The humans had walked away, and the council was doomed. Months passed after the humans walked away from the Galactic Council, and things seemed to settle down. The galaxy continued to turn, life continued as usual, and the council thought they had moved past this strange, unexpected refusal. But they were wrong. While the council focused on its usual operations, something was happening on the outskirts of known space. A human ship, the Vanguard, a sleek, silver vessel, appeared at the edge of council territory. It wasn't just any ship, it was a symbol of humanity's growing presence. The ship was heavily armed, but there was no sign of hostility. Instead, it broadcast a simple message across all frequencies. We are not your enemies, but we will not be your subjects. The message sent shockwaves through the council. The humans had left, and now they were openly challenging the very authority of the council. A few days later, the Vanguard passed into council-controlled space, docking at a neutral station on the edge of their territory. The station was known for being a neutral meeting point for different species, where discussions were meant to be peaceful. Makar, the high-ranking council member who had been so worried about humanity's growing influence, was summoned. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She boarded the Vanguard, bringing with her a delegation of council leaders to meet with the humans face-to-face. When the meeting began, it wasn't what the council expected. The humans didn't shout. They didn't demand anything. Instead, Captain Lin, who had been the one to speak on behalf of humanity before, sat across from Makar with a calm expression. She spoke with clarity, yet every word carried weight. "We are not interested in fighting you, Makar," Captain Lin said. "We simply want to live on our terms and help others live on theirs. We don't need your approval to exist." Makar's gaze narrowed. "You walked away from the council. You think you can survive without us? The power we have, the laws we create, the trade routes we control, all of it is for the greater good. You have no idea what you're up against." Lin remained silent for a moment, her eyes reflecting nothing but resolve. "We know exactly what we're up against, and we're ready to face it." One of Makar's aides, an impatient Zalorian, stepped forward. "You speak as if you know everything, but you know nothing about the balance we have worked for. Your people are naive. You've never faced a real conflict on a galactic scale." "Perhaps," Captain Lin responded calmly, "but we have faced our own battles. We have been through wars, struggles, and crises. We know the value of unity, but we also know the cost of freedom, and it is a cost we are willing to pay." The atmosphere in the room was tense. Makar was not one to back down easily, but she found herself struggling to understand the humans' resolve. They didn't seem afraid. They didn't beg for mercy. They didn't even offer to negotiate their way back into the council. Makar thought she had it all figured out. The council had always dealt with races that were either willing to cooperate or were too weak to resist. But humanity wasn't like that. They had a fire in their hearts that made them stand out from every other species the council had ever encountered. They didn't need permission, and they didn't fear what was coming. The meeting ended without any promises or agreements. Makar couldn't get the words out of her mind. They didn't fear us. Why didn't they fear us? Weeks later, a series of strange events began to unfold. First, there were reports from smaller planets in the outer rim. They began to see human ships entering their space, but there was no sign of aggression. The humans would simply dock, exchange goods, and leave. Sometimes they would teach new farming techniques or offer medical help, sometimes simply share knowledge. These planets were not part of the Council. They were independent, free to make their own decisions. Yet, humanity's actions were bringing them closer to the humans than they ever had been to the Council. Then came a few more reports. One from the Ether, a powerful and warlike race. The Ether had long been a thorn in the side of the Council, known for their brutal tactics and harsh rule. They had clashed with the Council on several occasions, but they always ended up forced to back down. But this time, something was different. A human vessel had arrived in Ether-controlled space. It was a small ship, no weapons, no aggressive moves. The Ether were certain this was a trap. The humans would be easy to destroy. But when the Ether fleet engaged, expecting a quick victory, the humans fought back, not with raw force, but with strategy. They used speed, intelligence, and technology the Ether had never seen. The humans outmaneuvered them, neutralized the Ether's weapon systems, and made it clear they were not to be underestimated. The Ether retreated, and word of the incident spread quickly. The Council's members watched in disbelief as the humans not only survived but thrived. They hadn't needed to conquer anything. They had simply shown that they were ready for whatever came next. The news reached Makar like a tidal wave. They are not just fighting, Makar said to herself, pacing in her office. They are changing the galaxy. They are showing others how to fight back. She understood then that the humans weren't just trying to survive. They were building something that could challenge the very structure of the Council. The more the humans interacted with other species, the more they offered knowledge, protection, and trade. The more they stood their ground, the more others respected them. But Makar couldn't allow that. The Council's power was at stake. If humans continued this, if they spread their message too far, the galaxy would no longer be under the Council's control. Makar called an emergency session of the Council. The future of the galaxy, she believed, depended on stopping humanity before it could grow too powerful. Humanity is not just a threat to our power, Makar told the gathered leaders. They are a threat to everything we've built. We must act now before it's too late. But as the Council members discussed their options, a quiet fear settled in. How could they stop humanity? How could they defeat a species that had not only walked away but had also gained so many allies? As the meeting continued, a silent truth hung in the air. The humans had done the impossible. They had shown the galaxy that they could stand alone, and not just survive, but thrive. And the Council realized they had underestimated humanity's greatest strength, their will to be free. The Galactic Council had always relied on its power, its fleets, its laws, its control over the galaxy's most important resources. But something was happening that they couldn't control, something they hadn't expected. Humanity was no longer just a small species on the edge of known space. It was quickly becoming the force that others respected, and in some cases, even feared. The first signs came from unexpected places. Planets that had once been too small or too isolated to make a difference were now thriving under human influence. They weren't just surviving, they were flourishing. Entire systems of independent worlds that had once lived under the shadow of the Council's rule were now aligning themselves with humanity. They began to take on human values, ideals that the Council had once dismissed as naive: freedom, cooperation, and the belief in self-determination. But what really alarmed the Council was the technology. No one knew how the humans had developed. It's so fast. No one knew how they had managed to make such incredible advancements in such a short amount of time. The Council had watched humans grow rapidly, but they didn't understand the source of their power. Now they were beginning to realize that humanity had something far more dangerous than just weapons or technology. They had an unmatched ability to innovate and adapt. Makar, who had been deeply worried about humanity's rise, began an investigation. She sent her most trusted agents to study human technology and tactics. She needed answers. Why were the humans able to outsmart the ether? How had they managed to negotiate peace with so many different species while the Council used its power to control and dominate? The agents returned with reports that only deepened Makar's unease. They had studied human ships, human weapons, and human strategies. They had observed how quickly the humans adapted to new environments, learned from their mistakes, and developed solutions to problems that no other species could solve. There was one thing that stood out above all. Humans had a unique way of thinking. They didn't approach problems the way others did. They didn't rely on brute force or overwhelming numbers. They relied on creativity, innovation, and a fierce determination to never give up. Makar sat in her office reviewing the reports. Her claws tapped the table as she read. The data was undeniable. The humans were not only surviving, they were changing the way the galaxy worked. They adapt too quickly, Makar whispered to herself. We can't keep up with them. No matter what we do, they always find a way. One of her aides, a young Vexen named Ral, looked up from his own data pad. You're saying that humanity has some kind of hidden power? Something we didn't see? Makar nodded slowly. Yes, it's not just their technology. It's how they think. It's their ability to learn, to grow, and to inspire others. They don't just fight for themselves, they fight for freedom, and that is dangerous. Ral frowned. But we've always controlled the galaxy with our strength. We have fleets, we have resources. The humans are just one species. How could they possibly stand up to us? Makar sighed, rubbing her eyes. It's not just about strength. The humans have something more powerful than all of our fleets. Combined, they have the will to stand alone, and they have the ability to inspire others to join them. Across the galaxy, humanity's influence was spreading further than anyone could have imagined. Human colonies had been established on planets previously considered too dangerous to colonize. These worlds were not just thriving, they were becoming hubs of innovation, trade, and cooperation. And other species were watching. One species, the Veyari, had been under the control of the Council for centuries. They were a peaceful race, known for their advanced agriculture and peaceful way of life. But they had always lived under the shadow of the Council's laws. The Council had taxed them heavily, restricted their trade, and imposed limits on their development. The Veyari had no choice but to comply. Or so they thought. Then, the humans arrived. A small human team landed on one of the Veyari's most important agricultural worlds, offering to share their knowledge of sustainable farming techniques. At first, the Veyari were suspicious. Why would the humans offer to help them? What was in it for them? But as the human team began working with the Veyari, it became clear that the humans were not there to take anything. They were there to help. They didn't ask for resources. They didn't ask for loyalty. They didn't even ask for recognition. They simply offered a better way of doing things. Soon the Veyari were not just adopting human methods, they were thriving. Their crops grew faster, their farms became more efficient, and their population began to grow at a rate they had never seen before. It wasn't just the farming techniques, it was the human philosophy that was beginning to take hold. The Veyari had always believed in harmony with nature, but now they were seeing how cooperation with others could create lasting prosperity. The Veyari leaders began to question the Council's authority. They had once feared the Council's might, but now they saw a new way forward, a way that didn't involve fear. And when the Veyari began to speak out against the Council, they found that they weren't alone. Other species, ones that had once been too weak, too afraid, or too oppressed to challenge the Council, began to join the movement. The spark that humanity had lit was spreading. Makar could feel it. She could feel the change in the air. The Council's power was slipping away, and she couldn't understand why. The humans hadn't attacked. They hadn't fired a single shot. They hadn't even sent a fleet. But they were making allies. They were changing hearts and minds. They were showing the galaxy that there was another way to live, one that didn't require submission to the Council's rule. It wasn't just the Veyari. Smaller species, once thought too weak to make a difference, were joining the humans' cause. The Drex, a race of intellectuals, sent representatives to Earth to learn about the human philosophy of self-determination. The Tareen, a species of peaceful engineers, offered their help in constructing new trade routes, free from the Council's restrictions. Makar's mind raced. What if we can't stop them, she thought. What if the galaxy has already made its choice? But the worst part was yet to come. The Council's most powerful fleets had been scattered across the galaxy, dealing with countless threats. And now, the one force they had always counted on, their overwhelming military might, wasn't enough to stop a new power. It wasn't a fleet. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even technology. It was something far more dangerous. It was hope. Hope for a new way of life, a new way of thinking, and the belief that freedom was worth fighting for. And humanity had just made the galaxy realize it. The ripple of change that humanity had set in motion grew into something much bigger than anyone had expected. What had started as a quiet refusal to join the Galactic Council had turned into a wave of rebellion that spread across the galaxy. The Council had underestimated humanity's resolve. Now the Council was on the defensive. It began on a small planet in the Outer Rim. A peaceful race, the Vix, had lived for centuries under the Council's rules. They were a gentle species, content with their simple life. But like many others, they were heavily taxed, their resources controlled by the Council, and their leaders were chosen not by their people, but by the Council itself. It was a system that kept them docile, but one they had learned to tolerate. When the humans arrived, everything changed. The Vix had heard the stories. They had seen how the humans had walked away from the Council without raising a weapon. But they were skeptical. Could one species truly make a difference? Could the humans help them? The answer came sooner than they expected. A small group of human diplomats arrived on Vix's homeworld, offering not weapons or threats, but knowledge. They spoke of freedom, of standing together against oppressive powers. They taught the Vix how to organize, how to communicate with other independent species, and how to protect themselves from Council interference. At first, the Vix were hesitant. They were afraid of what might happen if they rebelled against the Council. But the humans didn't pressure them. They simply gave them the tools they needed to make their own decisions. The Vix learned to defend themselves, to make their own laws, and most importantly, they learned the power of unity. 1 year later, the Vix launched their first peaceful protest against the Council. They gathered in their capital city, holding signs that read, "We choose our own path." It was a quiet act, but it was enough to send shockwaves through the galaxy. The Council reacted swiftly. They sent fleets to intimidate the Vix, to force them back into submission, but the Vix didn't back down. Instead, they reached out to the humans. The Vanguard and other human ships arrived, not with weapons, but with supplies and support. The Vix had learned from the humans, and now they were standing side by side, refusing to be controlled any longer. When the Council's fleets arrived at the Vix homeworld, they expected a quick victory. But they didn't get one. The Vix, with the help of the humans, had prepared. They had set up defenses, and they used their knowledge of the land and human technology to hold off the Council's forces. The battle was not one of destruction, but of defense and resilience. The Council's fleets had never faced anything like it. The humans didn't fight like any species they had ever encountered. They didn't follow traditional battle tactics. They outwitted the Council's forces at every turn, using clever strategies and rapid adaptations. It was a fight of wills, and the humans had a strength the Council didn't understand: the will to never give up. The Vix victory was a turning point. It was the first time in galactic history that a planet had stood up to the Council and won, without firing a single shot in anger. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a victory of ideals. The Vix had shown the galaxy that they could take back control of their future, just as the humans had. The news spread quickly. The Vix were not alone. Other species that had been oppressed by the Council began to rise up as well. The Drex, once quiet and submissive, began to voice their discontent. The Tareen, peaceful engineers, offered their assistance in building systems to protect their worlds from the Council's reach. Even the Ether, once the fiercest of the Council's allies, began to question their loyalty. It was no longer just about humanity. It was about freedom. The spark that the humans had lit was spreading, and now many species were embracing it. Makar sat in a dark room, staring at the reports. The Council had lost control of dozens of systems in a matter of months. Worlds that had once been loyal to the Council were now questioning its authority. The idea that humanity could stand alone and thrive was catching fire. Everywhere she looked, there were signs of an uprising, a quiet rebellion that was too strong to ignore. She clenched her fists. This cannot be allowed to continue. The Council must remain in power. But there was little she could do. The more the Council tried to push back, the more the resistance grew. The humans had shown the galaxy that freedom was possible, and now, that idea was spreading faster than the Council could control it. Back on Earth, Captain Lin and her crew watched the news from the front lines. The Vix had won, but that was just the beginning. More systems were beginning to break away from the Council. More species were rallying around the humans and their message of self-determination. "We knew this was coming," Lin said, speaking to her crew. "The Council will never allow this to go unchecked, but we've shown the galaxy that it's possible. They can choose their own path, just like we did." One of her officers, a young human named Rika, nodded. "And they'll keep fighting. For freedom, for their right to exist on their own terms." Lin smiled. "Exactly. The Vix weren't the last, and they won't be the only ones. The galaxy is waking up." On the outer rim of Council-controlled space, planets that had long been under the Council's thumb began to declare their independence. Some did it peacefully. Others, like the Vix, fought back with whatever they had. The human influence had spread to every corner of the galaxy, and with it came the idea that no one should be ruled by a distant power. The Galactic Council had never faced anything like it before. They had always relied on force to maintain control, but now they were losing power piece by piece. It wasn't just the Vix. It was the entire galaxy that was rising up, inspired by humanity's refusal to bow down. Makar had once believed that the Council's power was unshakable. Now she wasn't so sure. The humans had shown that when people were given the freedom to choose, they could change the galaxy. And once that idea took root, nothing could stop it. It wasn't about weapons. It wasn't about armies. It was about the belief that freedom was worth fighting for, and that was something the Council had never understood. The uprising had begun, and the Council, no matter how hard they tried, couldn't stop it. The galaxy was changing. It wasn't just the rise of independent worlds or the growing influence of humanity that signaled the shift. No, it was something far deeper, something that the Galactic Council, for all its power, couldn't control. Humanity had sparked a revolution, not just against the Council, but against the very idea of centralized, oppressive rule. The first signs of the Council's desperation came when they began to attack planets that had declared their independence. Entire fleets were dispatched to reassert control, to crush the growing rebellion. But every time humanity fought back, and they didn't fight with the weapons of war, they fought with unity, with courage, with ideas that were impossible to suppress. On Earth, Captain Lin had been preparing for this. She knew the Council would retaliate. She knew that the galaxy wasn't ready to accept humanity's independence. But she also knew that they couldn't back down. "We've got to be ready for what comes next," Lin said to her crew one quiet evening aboard the Vanguard. "The Council will not stop until they've crushed every one of us. But we will not kneel. Not now. Not ever." She had always believed in the power of humanity to change the course of the galaxy. But now it was clear that more than just the humans were involved. The Vix, the Terrene, the Drex, countless species who had once been silent under the Council's rule, had begun to stand up. The spark that humanity had lit was no longer a fire that could be extinguished. One of the largest moments in the rebellion came when a massive flotilla of human ships led by the Vanguard began to move through space. They weren't just evacuating. They were calling for all the other worlds who had joined the rebellion to stand with them, to leave the Council's rule behind forever. It wasn't a fight for territory or resources. It wasn't about weapons or conquest. It was about freedom. The idea that the galaxy could be a place where any species could choose its own path without fear of oppression. It was a vision humanity had given the galaxy, and now it was being realized. The Great Exodus had begun. For many, it wasn't just about abandoning the council. It was about finding a new way to live. And for those who had spent their entire lives under the council's rule, it was terrifying. They were leaving behind everything they had known, the safety of their established systems, the stability that the council had once provided. But in its place was the unknown, a chance to start fresh, to live without fear of a controlling force that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. Makar, still seated at the heart of the council, watched as the reports came in. Human ships accompanied by new allies were massing in space. Entire colonies were uprooting, leaving behind the places they had called home for centuries. Whole fleets of ships moved towards the unknown, escaping the council's grasp. "We must stop them," Makar said, her voice sharp. "We cannot allow this rebellion to spread further." But even she could see the writing on the wall. The council had sent their fleets to deal with the Exodus, but it wasn't working. The human fleets had become more than just militarily powerful. They had become symbols of hope. Everywhere the humans went, they brought knowledge, they brought ideas, they brought the promise of a future where the people controlled their own destinies. The Vanguard and its sister ships led a fleet of hundreds, of ships filled with refugees, scientists, engineers, and warriors, all fleeing the council's control. They weren't looking for a fight. They didn't want war. They simply wanted to be free. And when they arrived at their new home, a distant system far from the reach of the council, they would build a new world. One where every species could live freely, without fear of a galactic power trying to impose its will. The council responded as they always had, with force. A fleet, the largest the council had ever sent, was mobilized. Makar led it, fully determined to crush the rebellion before it could spread. But as the council's ships moved toward the fleet of refugees, something unexpected happened. Humanity wasn't alone anymore. The Veyari, the Vix, the Drex, the Tarin, and countless others stood with them. Their fleets joined with humanity's ships in a massive show of unity. Together they formed a blockade that stretched across the galaxy's borders, an impenetrable wall of ships, unwilling to back down. They were not going to run anymore. They were not going to hide. They were going to fight, not with weapons, but with their spirit. The council's fleet hesitated. For the first time in centuries, they faced something they had never encountered before. A united front of independent species, standing together, ready to defend their right to freedom. Makar stood at the helm of the flagship, her hands gripping the control panel tightly. She could feel the weight of the decision before her, the decision to fight to crush this rebellion once and for all. But she knew that if they did, they would lose everything. They would lose their power. They would lose their control. And perhaps more importantly, they would lose the galaxy itself. The council had relied on fear for so long. Fear had kept species in line. Fear had kept them under control. But now, fear was no longer enough. Humanity had shown the galaxy that it was possible to stand up, to walk away from the shadows of the powerful, to build something new and beautiful in its place. And now, species from all corners of the galaxy were coming together, not because they had been forced to, but because they believed in something greater. Makar turned away from the control panel and looked out at the stars. The weight of the galaxy seemed to press down on her shoulders. She had always believed that the council's power was unshakable, but now she saw that it was fragile, and she knew that if the council went to war now, it would be the beginning of its end. The decision had been made, the humans had walked away, and now the galaxy was walking with them. The day the council finally realized they had lost control was not marked by a single battle or a final confrontation. Instead, it was the result of countless small victories, each one building on the last, until the entire foundation of their power began to crumble. The Great Exodus, once a whisper of rebellion, had grown into a tidal wave of resistance, as humans and their allies, once scattered across the galaxy, gathered together. They had created something unstoppable, a coalition. a free species, united by the belief that their fate was their own. And in doing so, they had shown the galaxy what true power looked like. The Council had made one critical mistake. They had thought that power came from control, from fleets, from laws. They had forgotten the true nature of strength, the strength that comes from unity, from standing together and from the courage to fight for what is right no matter the cost. Captain Lin stood on the bridge of the Vanguard, watching the stars pass by. She had been here before, leading her crew through countless challenges. But today was different. Today she wasn't just leading humanity. She was leading an entire coalition of species who had chosen freedom over submission. They weren't just escaping. They were building a future. "We're almost there," Lin said, her voice steady but filled with anticipation. The ships of the human fleet, along with their allies, had gathered in the remote sector of the galaxy, far from the reach of the Council's fleets. This was where they would make their stand, where they would prove to the galaxy that they could live free, without the Council's oversight, without fear of the endless grasp of power. Lin's comms officer, a young officer named Rika, looked up from her station. "Captain, we've received word from the Terrene. The blockade is in place, we're ready." Lin nodded. "Good, let's begin." Across the galaxy, the moment of truth had arrived. The Council's fleets, still regrouping, after their earlier failed attempts to quell the rebellion, were converging on the sector where the coalition had gathered. Makar, desperate to crush the uprising once and for all, had ordered a full-scale attack, thinking that this would be their final victory. But the truth was, the Council was already too late. The tide had turned, and they were no longer the force that commanded the galaxy. The first sign of trouble came when the Council's fleets, poised for battle, encountered an unexpected obstacle. The newly formed coalition had set up an impenetrable blockade made up of ships from hundreds of species all united in the same cause. The human fleets led the charge, but they were no longer alone. The Council's commanders, once confident in their superiority, were now faced with a network of ships that had learned to fight differently. They were no longer relying on sheer firepower. Instead, they used strategy, intelligence, and the knowledge of each world's unique strengths. Every ship, every ally had a role to play in this fight, and the Council could not keep up. As the battle raged on, Makar's face grew pale. She watched the holographic displays showing the progress of her fleets, ships breaking apart, engines disabled, and entire battalions retreating in disarray. It was a nightmare. How had it come to this? "The blockade is holding," one of her officers reported, a hint of panic in his voice. "We're not getting through. The humans, they've outsmarted us." Makar clenched her fists, feeling the weight of her decisions. She had always believed that the Council's strength lay in its control, in its ability to dominate. But now, she saw the truth. The Council had lost its power, not because it had been defeated in battle, but because the galaxy had chosen to move on without it. The people had rejected fear, and now they were embracing freedom. It wasn't just the humans who had stood against the Council, it was every species that had joined them. And together they had created something greater than anything the Council could have ever imagined. Captain Lin watched from the Vanguard as the Council's fleet began to retreat. She knew this was it. This was the moment that would define the future of the galaxy. The humans, the Veyari, the Vix, the Drex, all of them had fought together, not for power, but for the right to choose their own fate. "Rika," Lin said, her voice calm but firm. "It's time. Send the message." Rika nodded, tapping a few commands into her console. The message, which had been carefully crafted over the past months, was sent across all frequencies. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was simply the truth. "To the Galactic Council," the message began, "we stand united as free peoples. We no longer seek your approval, your control, or your laws. We will no longer live in fear. We have chosen our path, and we will walk it together, in peace. You may continue to fight, but we will no longer be your subjects. The galaxy has moved on. It is time for you to do the same." The message echoed across the galaxy, reaching every corner of the Council's domain. It was a simple message, but one that carried the weight of generations of oppression, of fear, of struggle, and now it was a message of hope. Makar watched as the Council's fleets turned in retreat, unable to fight the unyielding will of the galaxy's people. The victory was not won by firepower or by destruction. It was won by unity, by the courage to stand together, no matter the odds. The galaxy had changed, and there was no turning back. The Council had fallen, not because they had been destroyed, but because they had lost their place in a galaxy that no longer needed them. The people had spoken, and they had chosen their future. On Earth, Captain Lin stood with her crew looking out at the stars. The battle was over, but the work had just begun. It wasn't about defeating an enemy. It was about building something new, something lasting. "We've won," Lin said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "But this is just the beginning. Together, we will make this galaxy a place where every species can walk its own path." And with that, the first chapter of a new galaxy began. One built on the foundations of freedom, unity, and the belief that no power, no matter how vast, could ever break the will of the people. The humans had walked away, and in doing so, they had changed everything.